Freedom, they said, was supposed to mean safety. But what happens when the people who finally taste liberty start vanishing one by one, and the only ones who notice are those with nowhere to turn? What happens when silence becomes a weapon, and the disappeared are mourned only by those society pretends don't exist? This is what happened in Ashland County, Georgia, during the years following the Civil War. And what makes it more disturbing is that it took decades before anyone outside that community even acknowledged something had gone wrong. This is the story of how an entire system conspired to pretend that crimes weren't happening, even as the evidence mounted. This is the story of one man who refused to look away, and the price his community paid for seeking truth in a place where truth was dangerous. Thomas Hayes had spent 34 years of his life as property. 34 years waking before dawn to work land he would never own, raising crops that would fill mouths that were not his, building wealth for a family that considered him livestock. The Barlow plantation stretched across 300 acres of Georgia red clay, cotton fields that seemed to extend to the edge of the world itself. Thomas had arrived there at age 14, sold away from his mother and siblings in Virginia, a transaction that took less time than buying a horse. He had learned quickly that survival meant making yourself valuable. He taught himself to read by studying a Bible he'd stolen from the plantation house library, risking a beating or worse if he'd been caught. He practiced letters by scratching them into the dirt behind his cabin, then smoothing them away before anyone could see. By the time he was 20, he could read better than the plantation owner's son, though he was careful never to let anyone know. When the war ended and word finally reached the Barlow plantation in the spring of 1865, Thomas stood in the cotton fields with 19 other formerly enslaved people and wept. The overseer, a man named Gideon Watts, who had wielded his whip with casual cruelty for 15 years, had delivered the news with barely contained rage. "You're free," he'd said, making the word sound like a curse. "Government says you can go, though where you'll go and how you'll survive, that's your problem now." They had no money, no education beyond what they'd taught themselves in secret, no legal protections worth the paper they were printed on. But they had something they had never possessed before, the right to leave. Most did. They scattered like seeds on the wind, some heading north toward rumored factory jobs, others west toward open territory, many simply walking until they found somewhere that didn't remind them of chains. Sarah Clemens left first, determined to find her daughter, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama 8 years earlier. Marcus Phelps headed for Atlanta, where he'd heard freed slaves were building their own schools and churches. The younger ones, those who had no memories tying them to this particular piece of Georgia, left without looking back. But Thomas stayed. Not because he loved Ashland County, or felt any attachment to the red clay soil that had drunk his sweat for over 3 decades. He stayed because his wife, Ruth, was buried there, in an unmarked grave on the edge of the plantation cemetery where the enslaved were laid to rest. His daughter Clara was buried beside her. Both had died of fever in the brutal summer of 1859, when Thomas had been forced to watch them suffer while working in the fields, because the plantation doctor said their illness wasn't serious enough to excuse Thomas from his labor. His son Daniel had also stayed. Daniel was 31 now, born into slavery but freed at an age where he still had strength and hope. Daniel had managed to secure a small patch of land just 5 miles from the old plantation, 40 acres that a northern carpetbagger had sold for almost nothing, more interested in quick cash than fair price. The soil was poor and the land prone to flooding, but it was land Daniel could work for himself. Thomas wasn't alone in staying. About 60 formerly enslaved people remained in Ashland County after the war, most clustering in an area that came to be known as Freeman's Quarter. Though no official documents called it that, and certainly no maps showed it. It was land nobody else wanted. swampy in the rainy season when the Okmulgee River overflowed its banks, hard-packed and stubborn in the drought when the sun baked the earth into something resembling brick. There were rattlesnakes in the tall grass and mosquitoes thick as fog in the summer evenings. But it was theirs, or as close to theirs as anything could be, in a place where the law was still written by those who had recently owned them. They built homes from scavenged wood and determination. Thomas constructed his cabin from planks, salvaged from an old tobacco barn that had collapsed during a storm, mixing clay and moss to fill the gaps between boards. It was 12 feet by 10 feet, with a stone fireplace he'd built himself and a roof that only leaked in 3 places. He'd lived in worse, much worse. They planted vegetables in soil they had to coax into cooperation: okra, collard greens, sweet potatoes, beans. They established a small church in a structure that had once been used for drying tobacco, hauling out the old racks, and installing rough-hewn benches that Daniel and 2 other men constructed. Someone found an old bell, cracked but still functional, and mounted it outside. When it rang on Sunday mornings, the sound carried across the settlement, calling people to worship. Thomas, who had learned to read by secretly studying that stolen Bible years earlier, became the informal record-keeper for the community. He wrote down births and deaths, marriages and land arrangements, keeping everything in a ledger he'd purchased with the first money he'd ever earned as a free man. Payment for a week's work repairing a fence for a farmer who had actually honored his promise to pay. The ledger was precious to him. It represented proof that their lives mattered, that their community existed, that they were people with histories worth recording. He kept it wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, and he wrote in it by candlelight in the evenings, his entries careful and methodical. January 15th, 1866, birth of Henry Tucker, son of Samuel and Martha Tucker. Healthy boy, 8 pounds. February 3rd, 1866. Marriage of James Foster and Caroline Webb, ceremony performed by Thomas Hayes, myself in the church, witnessed by entire community. March 12th, 1866, death of Moses Crawford, age approximately 72, cause natural decline, buried in the church cemetery. For 2 years, life was hard but hopeful. The community grew slowly. A few more families arrived, refugees from nearby areas where hostility toward freed slaves had turned violent. The church congregation swelled to nearly 80 people. Children were born, the first generation to take their first breaths in freedom, to never know the weight of chains, though they would learn soon enough that freedom itself could be a complicated thing in a place that resented their existence. A school teacher named Margaret Lawson arrived from Atlanta in the spring of 1867, a light-skinned woman in her 30s who'd been educated in the North. She started teaching children, and many adults, to read in the church building after services on Sundays. Thomas attended her classes despite his age, wanting to improve beyond the rudimentary literacy he'd taught himself. Margaret brought books, precious and rare, and sometimes she would read aloud to the whole community, her voice bringing to life stories of distant places and different possibilities. Thomas's son Daniel married a woman named Rachel Washington, who had walked to Ashland County from South Carolina, looking for an aunt she'd been separated from during the war. She never found her aunt, but she found a community that welcomed her, and in Daniel she found something she'd thought was lost forever: the possibility of building a family that couldn't be torn apart at someone else's whim. When Rachel gave birth to a baby girl, they named her Ruth, after Thomas's late wife. Thomas held his granddaughter for the first time on a warm evening in May 1867. This tiny creature with perfect fingers and lungs that could wail loud enough to wake the entire settlement. Looking down at her, feeling the weight of her in his arms, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. He was wrong. Benjamin Porter was the kind of man people noticed. Not because he was loud or boastful, but because of the quiet competence he brought to everything he did. At 26 years old, he stood just under 6 feet tall, with hands that were equally skilled at delicate woodwork and heavy labor. He'd learned carpentry during slavery, apprenticed to a white craftsman who had grudgingly admitted that Benjamin had more natural talent than any white apprentice he'd trained. After freedom came, Benjamin had set up a small workshop in a cabin on the eastern edge of Freeman's Quarter. He built furniture, chairs, tables, simple cabinets, bed frames. His work was good, sturdy and well made, with joints that fit tight and surfaces sanded smooth. Word spread, and soon he was taking orders from both black and white families in the area, though white customers usually sent servants to pick up the items rather than visit Freeman's Quarter themselves. Some white folks wouldn't even acknowledge where the furniture came from, preferring to pretend it had simply appeared rather than admit they'd paid a former slave for his craftsmanship. Benjamin lived alone. He'd been married once during slavery to a woman named Julia. They'd jumped the broom in a ceremony that had no legal weight but meant everything to them. 6 months later, Julia had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Benjamin had never seen her again, never learned what became of her, never stopped wondering if she was alive somewhere, if she ever thought of him, if she remembered the promises they'd made to each other under an oak tree on a Sunday afternoon. He didn't talk about her much. The pain was still too raw even years later. Instead, he threw himself into his work, finding a kind of meditation in the rhythm of planing wood, the satisfaction of seeing a piece of furniture take shape from raw lumber. His cabin was small but tidy, the workshop area taking up more space than his living quarters. Wood shavings covered the floor, and the smell of sawdust and wood varnish permeated everything. People liked Benjamin. He was steady, reliable, someone you could count on to do what he said he'd do. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the back row and singing hymns in a surprisingly good baritone. He helped neighbors with repairs, never asking for payment unless they offered. When the church needed new benches, Benjamin built them at cost, spending 2 weeks on the project. On Wednesday, October 23rd, 1867, Benjamin walked into Ashland proper to purchase supplies from the general store. The store owner, a man named Albert Grayson, recorded the transaction in his ledger: 3 pounds of nails, 1 quart of wood varnish, 2 pounds of sandpaper. Total cost, 90 cents. Benjamin paid and carried his purchases back toward Freeman's Quarter. That was the last confirmed sighting of Benjamin Porter. He didn't show up for church that Sunday, October 27th. Thomas noticed his absence but didn't think much of it initially. Benjamin sometimes worked through Sundays when he had orders to fill, and there was no law saying attendance was mandatory. But by Monday evening, when Benjamin still hadn't been seen, Thomas felt the first stirring of concern. On Tuesday morning, Thomas walked to Benjamin's cabin. It was about a 20-minute walk from his own place, following a path that wound through pine trees and around a small pond where frogs sang in the evenings. The October air was crisp, leaves beginning to turn, the kind of weather that made you grateful to be alive. The cabin was quiet when Thomas arrived. Too quiet. No sounds of work coming from inside, no smoke rising from the chimney, even though mornings were getting cold enough that most people kept a small fire going. "Benjamin," Thomas called out, approaching the door. "You home?" No answer. Thomas tried the door. It was unlocked, swinging open easily. Inside, everything was exactly as Benjamin always kept it, organized and clean. The bed was made, the blankets tucked in with military precision. The workshop area was neat, tools arranged on the wall in careful order. A half-finished chair sat on the workbench, one leg still needing to be attached, the wood joints already cut and ready for assembly. On the small table that served as Benjamin's eating area, Thomas found a plate with remnants of a meal: cornbread crumbs, the stain of beans. The plate was dry, the food eaten days ago. Beside it was a cup, also empty. A candle had burned down to a stub. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood or indication of violence. Benjamin's few possessions were all present. His spare clothes hanging on pegs, his shaving razor on a shelf, a small wooden box where he kept his money. Thomas opened the box and found $3.40 inside, money Benjamin had been saving toward purchasing more tools. But Benjamin himself was gone. Thomas stood in the quiet cabin, feeling dread settle in his stomach like a stone. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. People didn't just disappear, leaving behind their money, their tools, their unfinished work, their entire life. He began asking around the community. Had anyone seen Benjamin since Wednesday? Sarah Tucker, who lived in the cabin nearest to Benjamin's, said she'd seen him return from town Wednesday evening carrying his purchases. I called out a greeting, she said. He waved back, seemed in good spirits, said he had work to finish and went into his cabin. That's the last I saw of him. Samuel Wright, who sometimes helped Benjamin with large projects, said Benjamin had mentioned he was expecting to start a big order soon, a dining table and 8 chairs for a family in town. He was excited about it, Samuel said it would be good money. He was going to use it to buy better lumber, maybe expand his workshop. Margaret Lawson, the school teacher, remembered Benjamin attending church 2 Sundays before his disappearance. He seemed perfectly normal, she said. Stayed after the service to help me arrange some books. We talked about maybe building some shelves for the school supplies. He said he'd be happy to do it. No one had any information that explained where Benjamin had gone or why. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything alarming. Thomas walked to the sheriff's office in Ashland proper, the white part of town, where freed slaves were tolerated during business hours but expected to be gone by sunset. The town itself was small, built around a central square with a courthouse at its center. The buildings were mostly wooden, some showing the wear of war years, others freshly painted in an attempt to reclaim pre-war prosperity. Sheriff William Parrish's office was on the ground floor of the courthouse, a room with a desk, a gun rack, and wanted posters on the walls. Parrish was a thick-necked man in his 50s who had served as a captain in the Confederate Army. He'd returned to Ashland County after the war and been elected sheriff within months, running on a platform that emphasized maintaining order and protecting traditional values, which everyone understood to mean keeping freed slaves in their place. Parrish was reading a newspaper when Thomas entered, boots propped on his desk. He looked up with obvious irritation at the interruption. "What do you want?" Parrish asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Thomas removed his hat, holding it in his hands, a gesture of deference he hated but knew was necessary. "I'd like to report a missing person, Sheriff." "Who?" "Benjamin Porter. He lives in Freeman's Quarter. Hasn't been seen since last Wednesday." Parrish lowered the newspaper slightly. "Benjamin Porter. That the boy who makes furniture?" "Yes, sir. He's 26 years old. Left his cabin sometime between Wednesday evening and Thursday morning. All his possessions are still there, including his money, his tools, unfinished work. He wouldn't have left those behind willingly. Maybe he went to visit someone. You people wander around a lot, don't you?" Thomas kept his voice carefully neutral. "Benjamin has no family in the area, Sheriff, no reason to travel. And he had orders to fill, work scheduled. He's a reliable man. His disappearance is completely out of character." "Out of character." Parrish swung his feet off the desk and leaned back in his chair, regarding Thomas with something between amusement and contempt. "You know what I think? I think your Benjamin Porter decided freedom meant he could just pick up and go wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Probably got bored with furniture making and went to try his luck somewhere else. That's what you people do, isn't it? No sense of responsibility or commitment. He left behind $3.40, sir, and valuable tools. A man doesn't abandon everything he owns without a word to anyone. People do strange things. Parrish picked up his newspaper again, a clear dismissal. If he turns up, let me know. But I'm not organizing a search party because some colored boy decided to move on. Thomas stood there for a moment, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. There would be no investigation, no search, no official interest whatsoever. In the eyes of the law, Benjamin Porter's disappearance didn't matter. It didn't even register as a problem worth acknowledging. "Is there anything else?" Parrish asked, not looking up from his newspaper. "No, sir," Thomas said quietly. "Nothing else." He walked out of the sheriff's office, feeling a helplessness he hadn't experienced since before freedom. Different circumstances, but the same fundamental reality. Their lives didn't matter to the people in power. But Thomas Hayes had not survived 34 years of slavery without learning resilience. If the authorities wouldn't search for Benjamin, the community would do it themselves. He organized a search party that afternoon. 15 men from Freeman's Quarter spent 3 days combing the woods and swampland around the settlement, calling Benjamin's name, looking for any trace. They searched in a grid pattern, making sure to cover every possible area. They waded through marshes, pushed through underbrush, checked abandoned structures. They found nothing. No tracks. No signs of struggle. No discarded items. No body. It was as if Benjamin Porter had simply ceased to exist, evaporating into the October air without leaving a single trace behind. After 3 days, they had to give up. People had their own work to tend to, their own families to feed. They couldn't spend every hour searching for someone who had left behind no clues about where he'd gone. At church that Sunday, Reverend Matthew Foster, a man who had preached in secret during slavery and now led the congregation openly, said a prayer for Benjamin's safe return. The entire community bowed their heads, and Thomas Hayes listened to the words while feeling certainty grow in his chest. Benjamin wasn't coming back. Something terrible had happened to him. After the service, Thomas opened his ledger and made an entry in his careful script. October 27, 1867. Benjamin Porter, age 26, missing since approximately October 23rd or 24. Last seen Wednesday evening, October 23rd, returning from Ashland proper with supplies. Cabin found undisturbed, all possessions present. Sheriff Parrish declined to investigate, suggesting Mr. Porter moved on. Community search conducted October 28-30, no trace found. Status: missing. Circumstances unknown. Thomas closed the ledger and sat for a long time, staring at the words he'd written. Something whispered in the back of his mind, a warning he couldn't quite articulate. But the warning was there, persistent and troubling. For several months, life returned to uneasy normalcy. People talked about Benjamin, especially in the early weeks. Theories circulated. Maybe he'd had a sweetheart in another county he'd never mentioned. Maybe he'd received word of his wife, Julia, and went to find her. Maybe he'd simply decided he wanted a fresh start and hadn't wanted to explain himself to anyone. Thomas wanted to believe these things. He tried to convince himself that Benjamin had left voluntarily, that there was some reasonable explanation for the abandoned money and tools and unfinished work. But he couldn't make himself believe it. The pieces didn't fit. And as winter turned to spring, that feeling of wrongness only grew stronger. Spring came late to Ashland County in 1868. The winter had been harsh. Colder than usual, with ice storms that knocked down tree branches and made travel treacherous. The community of Freeman's Quarter huddled through those cold months, burning wood to stay warm and eating through stored food supplies that were never quite enough. By March, when the weather finally began to warm, everyone was eager for renewal. Gardens were planted. Repairs postponed during winter were undertaken. Children who had been cooped up in small cabins ran outside to play in the mud and sunshine. Esther Vaughn was one of the busiest people in the community that spring. At 41, she was a midwife who had been helping bring babies into the world since she was 16 years old. She had delivered dozens of babies during slavery, both black and white, working without pay, but with a reputation for skill and gentle care. After freedom, she continued her work, now receiving payment that allowed her to support herself and her daughter, Lizzie. Esther was a small woman with graying hair. She kept wrapped in bright-colored scarves. She had quick, capable hands and a calm demeanor that put laboring mothers at ease. She carried a medical bag, a leather satchel that had been given to her by a white doctor who'd recognized her talent and taught her things beyond what she'd learned through experience. The bag contained basic instruments, clean cloths, herbal remedies she prepared herself, and a bottle of laudanum for the worst cases. She served both the black and white communities, one of the few people who regularly moved between Freeman's Quarter and Ashland proper without harassment. Even the most prejudiced white families recognized that Esther's skills were valuable. When a white woman was in difficult labor, Esther was the one they called. She had saved more lives than anyone could count, mother and child both, and that gave her a measure of respect that was rare for a black woman in post-war Georgia. Esther lived with her daughter Lizzie, who was 19, in a cabin that was larger than most in Freeman's Quarter. Esther had been able to afford improvements: wooden floors instead of packed earth, glass windows instead of shutters, a real stove instead of just a fireplace. Lizzie helped her mother with the midwifery work sometimes, learning the trade, though Esther was hoping Lizzie might be able to do something different, maybe become a teacher like Margaret Lawson. On Tuesday, March 10th, 1868, Esther was at home preparing dinner when someone knocked on her door. It was early evening, the sun just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lizzie answered the door. Standing outside was a young white man Esther didn't recognize, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, wearing dusty work clothes and a nervous expression. "My mama needs the midwife," the young man said, breathing hard like he'd been running. "She's having the baby and something's wrong. She's bleeding bad and my papa sent me to fetch you quick." Esther was already grabbing her bag. "Which farm?" "The Hendricks place, ma'am, about 6 miles west of here." Esther knew the Hendricks family. She'd delivered 2 of their previous children. The mother, Anna Hendricks, was a small woman who'd had difficult births before. If she was hemorrhaging, it could be life-threatening for both mother and child. "I'm coming now," Esther said. She turned to Lizzie. "I'll probably be there all night. Don't wait up." "Be careful, Mama," Lizzie said, something in her voice that Esther would later remember, a note of concern that went beyond the usual worry about difficult births. Esther kissed her daughter's cheek and followed the young man outside. The evening was cool but pleasant, the first real warmth after the brutal winter. She could smell earth and growing things, the promise of spring. Her neighbor, Sarah Tucker, was outside tending to her evening chores. She called out to Esther, "Where you headed at this hour?" "Hendricks Farm," Esther called back. "Baby coming. Be safe," Sarah said, waving. Those were the last words anyone from Freeman's Quarter would ever hear Esther Vaughn speak. The next morning when Lizzie woke up, her mother's bed was empty. This wasn't unusual. Difficult births often took longer than expected. But by midday, when Esther still hadn't returned, Lizzie began to worry. By evening, she was frightened. She walked to the Hendricks farm. It was a long walk, over 6 miles, but Lizzie was young and strong, and she needed to know her mother was all right. When she arrived at the Hendricks place, the family was sitting down to dinner. Anna Hendricks answered the door, looking surprised to see Lizzie. "Can I help you?" Anna asked. "I'm Esther Vaughn's daughter," Lizzie said. "I'm looking for my mother. She came here last night for the birth." Anna's face showed confusion. "What birth? I'm not due for another 3 months." The world seemed to tilt beneath Lizzie's feet. "But a young man came to our cabin yesterday evening, said you were in difficult labor, bleeding badly. My mother went with him." "I didn't send anyone," Anna said. And I certainly wasn't in labor. Are you sure he said this farm? He said the Hendricks place. He described you by name. James Hendricks, Anna's husband, appeared behind his wife. He was a tall man with a grey beard, stern but not unkind. We don't have anyone here fitting that description, he said. Our eldest son is 23 and he's been here all day yesterday and today. We have no teenage boys. Lizzie felt panic rising in her throat. Then where is my mother? Where did she go? I don't know, girl, James said, his expression troubled. But she never came here. Lizzie ran back to Freeman's Quarter, ran the entire 6 miles with tears streaming down her face, arriving after dark, exhausted and terrified. She went straight to Thomas Hayes's cabin, pounding on the door until he opened it. Someone took my mama, Lizzie sobbed. Someone came with a lie and took her away, and now she's gone. Thomas felt ice in his veins. Not again. Please, God. Not again. He gathered several men and they retraced the route Esther would have taken to the Hendricks farm. They searched by torchlight, calling her name, looking for any sign. They found nothing. The road was well traveled, any tracks hopelessly mixed with dozens of others. At dawn, Thomas went to Sheriff Parrish's office. I need to report a missing person, Thomas said. Esther Vaughn. She's a midwife. She was lured away from her home Tuesday evening under false pretenses and hasn't been seen since. Parrish looked up from his morning coffee. Lured away? Thomas explained the situation. The young man who had claimed to be from the Hendricks farm, the family confirming they'd sent no one and had no such emergency. Sounds to me like your Esther got confused about which farm, Parrish said. Probably went to the wrong place, got lost in the dark. She'll turn up. She's lived here for decades. She knows every farm in the county. She wouldn't get lost. And the Hendricks family confirmed no young man matching the description lives there or was sent from there. Well, maybe she had her own reasons for leaving. Maybe there was more to this story than you know. Her medical bag is gone, but all her other possessions are at home. Her money, her clothes, her daughter. People do strange things, Parrish said, using almost the exact same words he'd used about Benjamin Porter. I'm sure she'll show up eventually. Will you investigate? Will you at least ask questions? I'll keep an ear out, Parrish said, which they both knew meant he would do nothing. Thomas walked out of the sheriff's office feeling a rage he had to work hard to control. 2 people now, 2 disappearances under suspicious circumstances, and the authorities' complete indifference. He returned to Freeman's Quarter and began asking questions throughout the community, carefully documenting what he learned. He wrote down everything. The description of the young man who'd come for Esther, the time he'd arrived, the exact words he'd spoken. He noted Sarah Tucker's confirmation that she'd seen Esther leave around 8 o'clock. He recorded his visit to the Hendricks farm and their statements. The community held a prayer service for Esther. Lizzie sat in the front row of the church, her face hollow with grief and incomprehension. Thomas looked at her and felt the weight of his responsibility. Someone needed to seek answers, even if those answers were terrible. 2 months later, in May of 1868, James Holloway disappeared. James was 19 years old, full of energy and ambition. He'd been born into slavery but freed while still young enough to dream of possibilities beyond Ashland County. He worked odd jobs throughout the area, repairing fences, digging wells, clearing land, anything that paid. He was saving every cent, keeping his money in a tin box buried near his cabin, with a plan to head north by the end of the year. He wanted to see Philadelphia, maybe find factory work there, maybe save enough to start his own business someday. James was last seen on Friday, May 15th, leaving a farm owned by a man named Tucker Harland. Harland confirmed that James had been clearing trees from a field, hard work that had taken 3 days. Harland had paid him $2 for the 3 days' work, which everyone knew was less than fair, but was what black laborers could expect. James had taken his payment and left around 6 o'clock in the evening. He never made it home. His brother Peter reported him missing the next morning. Thomas organized another search. They found nothing. No trace, no sign of struggle, nothing. 3 disappearances now. Then, in July, Mary Tucker vanished. She was 16 years old, Sarah Tucker's youngest daughter, known throughout Freeman's Quarter for her beautiful singing voice. She'd been walking home from Margaret Lawson's house, where she'd been helping with evening lessons, when she disappeared. It was only a 15-minute walk, but Mary never arrived home. Sarah Tucker walked the route herself, calling her daughter's name into the darkness, finding nothing but silence. In September, it was Joseph King, a 52-year-old farmer who had just harvested his first successful tobacco crop as a free man. He'd sold the crop for a good price, $40, more money than he'd ever had in his life. He'd hidden the money carefully and was planning to use it to buy better farming equipment. 3 days after selling his crop, Joseph vanished while walking home from Ashland proper. 5 people in less than 2 years. 5 people who had vanished without explanation, without bodies, without anyone in authority caring enough to ask why. Thomas Hayes, now 67 years old and feeling every year of it, sat in his cabin late one September night and stared at the entries in his ledger. 5 names, 5 sets of circumstances, 5 mysteries that he knew in his bones were connected, were not coincidental, were evidence of something dark and deliberate happening in Ashland County. He began creating a separate section in his ledger, dedicated entirely to the disappearances. He wrote down everything he knew about each case, looking for patterns, for connections, for anything that might explain what was happening. And slowly, painfully, a pattern began to emerge. Thomas Hayes was not a detective. He had no training in investigation, no authority to question witnesses, no resources beyond his own determination and his ability to write down what he observed. What he did have was a lifetime of watching, of paying attention, of noticing the things that happened around him. Skills developed during decades of slavery, when survival often depended on reading situations accurately and understanding unspoken dynamics. He began by creating a detailed record of each disappearance. In his cabin, by candlelight, he would spend hours writing, organizing his thoughts, trying to make sense of chaos. For each missing person, he documented full name and age, physical description, last known location and time, who last saw them, and under what circumstances, what they were doing, where they were going, what was left behind, any unusual details or suspicious elements. He drew a map of Ashland County on a large piece of paper, carefully sketching the main roads, the river, the locations of farms and settlements. He marked Freeman's Quarter clearly, then marked where each person had last been seen with an X and the person's initials. Looking at the map, he noticed something immediately. All 5 people had disappeared while in or near the white parts of Ashland County. None had vanished from within Freeman's Quarter itself. He made a timeline, laying out the disappearances chronologically. Benjamin Porter, October 23rd at 24, 1867. Esther Vaughan, March 10th, 1868, evening. James Holloway, May 15th, 1868, evening. Mary Tucker, July 22nd, 1868, evening. Joseph King, September 17th, 1868, evening. All 5 had disappeared during evening or night hours, none during full daylight. He created a list of what each person had been doing when they vanished. Benjamin, returning from purchasing supplies in town. Esther, responding to a fake medical emergency. James, leaving a farm after completing paid work. Mary, walking home in early evening. Joseph, returning from town after selling his crop. All 5 had connections to work or services they provided to white families. All 5 were either traveling alone or were isolated from their community at the moment of disappearance. Thomas shared his findings with his son Daniel and several other trusted men in the community, Reverend Foster, Samuel Wright, and Marcus Webb, a man who had fought in the Union Army during the war and had a soldier's way of thinking about tactics and threats. They met in Thomas's cabin on a cool evening in late October 1868, exactly 1 year after Benjamin Porter had disappeared. The men sat on stools and barrels, cramped in the small space, speaking in voices barely above whispers, even though no one could overhear them. Thomas spread his map and his timeline on the small table. "Look at this," he said. "Look at the pattern." They studied the documents in silence. Marcus Webb, who could read thanks to his time in the army, traced his finger across the timeline. "All evening disappearances," he said. "Easier to take someone in darkness." "And all near white areas," Samuel added. "All away from our community." "They're targeting us," Daniel said, his voice tight with anger. "Someone is deliberately taking our people." "But who?" Reverend Foster asked. "And why? What would anyone gain from this?" That was the question Thomas couldn't answer. Not yet. But he had theories, dark theories, that he was almost afraid to speak aloud. "During slavery," Thomas said carefully, "we were valuable as property. We represented wealth, labor, income. When slavery ended, the people who owned us lost that wealth. Some of them lost everything they had. You think someone is trying to... what? Recapture us? Bring back slavery?" Marcus's hand unconsciously moved to his hip, where he used to wear his army-issue revolver before he'd been forced to surrender it after returning to Georgia. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that there are people who refuse to accept that we're free. People who are angry about what they lost and are looking for ways to maintain the old arrangements under different names." "But how?" Daniel asked. "Where would they be taking people? You can't just keep slaves openly anymore." The law," Thomas interrupted bitterly, "requires someone to enforce it. And who enforces the law in Ashland County?" "Sheriff Parrish," Samuel said. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by fear. "You think the sheriff is involved?" "I think the sheriff has shown absolutely no interest in investigating these disappearances. I think he's dismissed every concern I've brought to him. I think..." Thomas hesitated, then pushed forward. "I think if the sheriff was involved, if he was protecting whoever is responsible, everything we've seen would make sense." Silence fell over the group. This was dangerous territory. Accusing the sheriff, even in private, was the kind of thing that could get a black man killed in Reconstruction, Georgia. "We need more information," Marcus said finally. "We need to know who's behind this. We need evidence." "How?" Reverend Foster asked. "We can't exactly walk up to white folks and start demanding answers." "No," Thomas agreed, "but we can listen. We can pay attention. Some of our people work in white households, in white businesses. They hear things. If we organize ourselves, if we start gathering information systematically." They talked for hours that night, developing a strategy. They identified people in the community who had regular contact with white families, domestic workers, laborers, anyone who might overhear conversations or observe suspicious activity. Thomas would coordinate the effort, collecting information and documenting everything. It was dangerous. If word got out that they were actively investigating, there would be retaliation. But doing nothing meant more disappearances. They had to try. Over the following weeks, Thomas quietly approached trusted community members and explained what he needed. Most agreed to help, motivated by fear for their own safety and determination to understand what was happening to their people. The information came in slowly, in fragments, in whispered conversations after church or in corners of the tobacco barn on quiet evenings. A woman named Delia Frazier pulled Thomas aside one Sunday in early November. Her cousin, Louise, worked as a cook for the Henderson family, one of the wealthiest families in the county. Henderson owned a lumber mill and several hundred acres of forest. "Louise heard something," Delia said quietly. "Something that frightened her." Thomas met with Louise a few days later in a secluded spot away from both Freeman's Quarter and the white parts of town. Louise was a woman in her 30s, thin and nervous, with good reason to be afraid of losing her position with the Henderson family. It was one of the better-paying jobs available to black women in the county. "I need you to understand," Louise said before telling him anything. "If this gets back to the Hendersons, if they find out I was listening to their private conversations, I'll lose my job. Or worse. I won't use your name," Thomas promised. "Whatever you tell me, I'll protect you." Louise took a deep breath. About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Henderson had a dinner party. 5 men, all wealthy landowners and businessmen. I was supposed to leave after serving dinner, but they had me stay late to clean up. I was in the kitchen, and they were in the study, and the doors were open because it was warm that night. Their voices carried. What did they say? They were drinking whiskey and smoking cigars, laughing about things I didn't understand at first. But then, Louise's hands were shaking. One of them said something about how there were ways to make up for what they'd lost when slavery ended. Another one laughed and said, "As long as no one asks questions." And Mr. Henderson said, "The sheriff understands the situation. He's not going to cause problems." Thomas felt his blood run cold. Did they mention any specifics? Any names? No names of colored folks, if that's what you mean. But one of them mentioned something about shipments and how they needed to be more careful about spacing them out. Another said business was good, that buyers weren't asking questions. They sounded pleased with themselves, confident. "Did you recognize the other men?" "Mr. Harland, the one who owns the logging operation and the mining concern. Mr. Yates, who runs the cotton gin. Sheriff Parrish, of course, and one other man I didn't know, younger, maybe 30, well-dressed. They called him Mr. Phillips." Thomas wrote all of this down later, his hand shaking with anger and fear. Shipments, buyers, the sheriff's involvement. It was starting to come together, forming a picture so horrific that part of him wanted to deny it was possible. But he knew better. He'd lived through slavery. He knew exactly what people were capable of when they valued profit over humanity. More information trickled in over the following weeks. A man named Robert Gill, who worked at the train depot loading and unloading freight, reported seeing crates loaded onto freight cars late at night, always under the supervision of Tucker Harland or his men. The crates were large enough to hold a person, though Robert had never seen inside them. They were always marked mining equipment or lumber supplies. A woman named Patience Morris, who did laundry for several white families, mentioned that she'd seen men gathering at Tucker Harland's property late at night on several occasions. "They arrive after dark," she said. "Sometimes I'm walking home late from work and I see lanterns on his property, see men moving around. They're doing something they don't want people to see in daylight." A field worker named Jackson Price reported that he'd been approached by Tucker Harland about a job. "He offered me twice the normal rate to help with some nighttime work," Jackson said. "Said it was moving freight to the river, had to be done at night for business reasons. Something about the offer felt wrong, felt dangerous. I told him I had family obligations and couldn't work nights. He got angry, tried to insist, but I held firm and walked away. I've been nervous ever since, watching my back." Thomas documented everything. He was building a case, though he wasn't sure what he could ever do with it. Who would listen? Who would care? The sheriff was implicated. The wealthy men involved had power and connections, and Thomas was a 67-year-old former slave with no legal standing to speak of. But he kept writing, because someone had to. Someone had to bear witness to what was happening, even if justice seemed impossible. By December of 1868, Thomas had developed a working theory about what was happening to the missing people of Ashland County. It was based on circumstantial evidence, second-hand accounts, and logical inference, nothing that would stand up in any court but enough to paint a terrible picture. He believed that a group of wealthy white men in Ashland County, facing financial ruin after the loss of slavery, had found a way to continue profiting from forced labor. They were capturing freed slaves, targeting individuals who could be isolated, who were away from their communities, who wouldn't be missed immediately by anyone with power or influence. The captured people were likely drugged or physically overpowered, then transported secretly. Tucker Harlan's logging operation provided perfect cover. Crates supposedly containing lumber or mining equipment loaded onto boats that traveled down the Ocmulgee River to coastal ports. From there, the captives could be sold to remote plantations, mining operations, or labor camps where no questions would be asked and no one would investigate working conditions. It was slavery continuing under a new guise, not legally sanctioned, but profitable enough that those involved were willing to take the risk. And with Sheriff Parrish ensuring no official investigation would take place, the risk was minimal. The system was clever in its brutality. By spacing out the disappearances and targeting people from different areas, they avoided creating too obvious a pattern. By taking people who were alone, away from witnesses, they minimized the chance of evidence. By involving the sheriff, they guaranteed official indifference. And by preying on freed slaves, people who had no political power, no legal advocates, no voice in the newspapers or halls of government, they ensured that no one with the ability to stop them would even know crimes were happening. Thomas knew he couldn't prove any of this. He had no physical evidence, no recovered victims to testify, no confessions, no documents. What he had were whispered reports from frightened workers, observations of suspicious activity, and a logical framework that explained the pattern of disappearances. It wasn't enough, but it was something. He called another meeting at his cabin, this time including more community members. 20 people crowded into the small space and spilled outside, forming a circle in the cold December darkness. Thomas presented his findings. He spoke carefully, sticking to facts when he had them, clearly identifying speculation when that's all he had. He showed them his maps, his timeline, his documented witness statements. When he finished, the silence was heavy and terrible. Finally, Sarah Tucker spoke up. She had lost her daughter Mary in July, and the grief had carved lines into her face that hadn't been there before. "So what do we do?" she asked. "If what you're saying is true, if people are being stolen and sold like we're still living in slavery times, what can we do about it?" "We protect ourselves," Thomas said. "We make ourselves harder to capture." Marcus Webb stepped forward. "Here's what I learned in the Army. You survive by understanding your enemy's tactics and denying them opportunities. These people are ambushing isolated individuals, so we don't give them isolated individuals." They spent hours that night developing a safety protocol for Freeman's Quarter. 1. No one travels alone, especially after dark. People move in groups of at least 3. 2. Anyone who needs to go into Ashland proper or work on white-owned farms informs multiple people of their plans, where they're going, when they expect to return, what route they're taking. 3. If someone doesn't return when expected, the community responds immediately with a search party and loud public inquiry. 4. People working in white households remain alert for suspicious conversations and report anything unusual to Thomas. 5. Anyone approached with offers of isolated work, especially at night, declines and reports the incident. 6. Children and teenagers never travel to white areas alone under any circumstances. 7. The church bell serves as an alarm. If anyone is threatened or witnesses something suspicious, ring the bell and the community assembles. "We can't stop them," Thomas said. "We don't have the power for that, but we can make it harder. We can make it more dangerous for them to try. We can survive until someone with authority finally decides to care." It was a fragile plan, built on hope that was even more fragile. But it was all they had. They implemented the protocols immediately. At first, people found them inconvenient, having to coordinate schedules, always traveling in groups, spending time they didn't have. But fear was a powerful motivator. The fear of vanishing, of being the next name in Thomas's ledger, of never seeing family again. For several months, the strategy worked. No one else from Freeman's Quarter disappeared during the winter of 1868-1869. The community maintained vigilance, and slowly, people began to feel slightly safer. But Thomas knew they were living on borrowed time. The people behind the disappearances hadn't stopped. They'd just been denied easy targets. And eventually, they would adapt. Eventually, they would find new ways to isolate victims, or they would come after the person making things difficult for them. Thomas Hayes had survived 67 years by understanding when he was in danger. During slavery, that instinct had kept him alive through brutal overseers, arbitrary punishments, and the constant threat of being sold away. After freedom, that same instinct told him when to be deferential, when to stay silent, when to make himself small and invisible. That instinct was screaming at him now. In early March of 1869, Thomas noticed he was being watched. Nothing obvious, nothing he could prove, but there. A man standing on the corner when Thomas walked into Ashland proper to purchase supplies. Someone who seemed to have no particular business, but whose eyes followed Thomas wherever he moved. A rider on the road outside Freeman's Quarter, sitting on horseback for no apparent reason, just watching. Daniel noticed it too. "Someone's keeping track of you, Papa," he said quietly one evening. "They're making sure you know you're being watched." "It's intimidation," Thomas replied. "They want me frightened." "Are you?" "Yes," Thomas admitted. "But being frightened never stopped me from doing what needed to be done." The warning came in mid-March, on a Tuesday afternoon that was unusually warm for the season. Thomas was working in the garden behind his cabin, planting seeds for the coming growing season, when he heard horses. He looked up to see Sheriff William Parrish riding into Freeman's Quarter, accompanied by 2 deputies. This was unprecedented. The sheriff never came to their community, never acknowledged its existence, except to make clear that any trouble would be met with overwhelming force. People stopped what they were doing. Work ceased. Children were called inside. Everyone watched as the 3 lawmen rode slowly through the settlement as if they owned it, as if they were surveying property rather than visiting a community of free people. Parrish stopped his horse in the area that served as the settlement's central square near the church. Thomas set down his gardening tools and walked toward them, aware that everyone in Freeman's Quarter was watching, aware that this confrontation would set a tone for everything that followed. "Which one of you is Thomas Hayes?" Parrish called out, though Thomas was certain the sheriff knew exactly who he was. "I am," Thomas said, stopping a few yards from the horses. He kept his hands visible, non-threatening. Parrish dismounted with deliberate slowness. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall and heavy with muscle and authority. He walked toward Thomas, his deputies staying mounted but with hands near their weapons. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you, Hayes," Parrish said, his voice carrying across the square. "Stories about you spreading rumors, making accusations against respected members of this community. I don't know what you're referring to, Sheriff." "Don't play dumb with me." Parrish stepped closer, invading Thomas's personal space. "You've been telling people that kidnapping is happening in this county, that upstanding citizens are involved in criminal activity. That's a serious accusation. One that could be considered slander, or worse, incitement to violence or rebellion." Thomas kept his voice level and respectful, even though rage was burning in his chest. "I've been documenting the disappearances of members of our community, Sheriff. That's all. Keeping records of missing people. Is that against the law? Missing people who probably just moved on. People do that, you know. They get tired of one place and move to another. It's what happens when people are free to wander wherever they want." "All 5 of them?" Thomas asked. "All of them left without telling anyone? Without taking their money or their possessions?" "Esther Vaughn left her daughter behind." Benjamin Porter left unfinished furniture orders. Joseph King left $40 hidden in his cabin. Does that seem like people who planned to leave? Parrish's face darkened with anger. Are you questioning my judgment? I'm asking you to investigate, Sheriff, to do your job, to find out what happened to these people. My job is to maintain order in this county, and you're disrupting that order with your conspiracy theories and your troublemaking. Parrish moved even closer, close enough that Thomas could smell tobacco on his breath. Let me be very clear, Hayes. This county doesn't take kindly to uppity colored men who forget their place. Reconstruction won't last forever. Federal troops won't be here to protect you indefinitely. And when they're gone, people like you will need to remember how things really work around here. The threat was explicit. Thomas forced himself to meet Parrish's eyes. I'm just trying to keep my community safe. Your community would be safer if you stopped stirring things up. If you stopped encouraging people to be suspicious and fearful. If you accepted that sometimes people leave and that's the end of it. Parrish stepped back, addressing the crowd that had gathered. The same goes for all of you. Stop listening to this old man's paranoid fantasies. Go about your business. Work hard. Stay out of trouble. And don't go making problems where there aren't any. He mounted his horse again, the deputies flanking him. Before leaving, Parrish looked down at Thomas one more time. This is your only warning, he said. Understand? Yes, sir, Thomas said, because that's what Parrish wanted to hear, what he needed to hear to feel his authority had been respected. The three lawmen rode out of Freeman's Quarter, leaving behind a community that was even more frightened than before. Thomas stood in the square, aware that everyone was looking at him, waiting to see what he would do. Reverend Foster approached first. Thomas, maybe the sheriff is right. Maybe we should— No, Thomas interrupted. He's not right. 5 people are missing. 5 people who didn't just move on. And the sheriff came here today not to investigate, not to offer help, but to threaten me into silence. That tells you everything you need to know about whether he's right. Marcus Webb stepped forward, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. They're scared. They came here because your investigation is making them nervous. That means you're getting close to something they want hidden. Maybe, Thomas said, or maybe they just want to intimidate us into compliance. Either way, Daniel said, joining the group. You're in danger now, Papa. They've marked you as a threat. Thomas nodded slowly. Then I need to be more careful. But I'm not stopping. That night, Thomas took his ledger and all his documentation and wrapped them carefully in oilcloth. He dug up a section of the floor in his cabin, creating a hidden compartment beneath the boards. He placed the ledger there, along with his maps and notes, then replaced the floorboards and scattered dirt and straw over them to hide any evidence of disturbance. He told Daniel where the ledger was hidden. If anything happens to me, Thomas said, you keep this going. You document everything. You make sure someone remembers. Nothing's going to happen to you, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Thomas smiled sadly. I've lived 68 years, son. Survived 34 years of slavery and seen things that would break most people. If my time comes, I'm ready. But this work, this matters. Someone has to bear witness. Promise me. Daniel promised. 3 weeks later, they came for Thomas. April in Ashland County was unpredictable. One day could be warm and pleasant, the next cold and stormy. The night of April 8, 1869, was hot and humid, the air thick with moisture that promised rain, but never delivered. Thomas went to bed in his cabin around 9 o'clock, windows open to catch any breeze that might ease the oppressive heat. He dreamed of his wife, Ruth. She was young again, the way she'd been when they first met before slavery had worn her down. They were dancing at a celebration, music playing somewhere, her laugh bright and free. In the dream, they were truly free, in a way they'd never been in life. No master, no chains, no fear. The dream ended when Thomas smelled smoke. At first, his sleeping mind tried to incorporate the smell into the dream, a cooking fire perhaps, something benign. But then he heard the crackle of flames and the sound dragged him into wakefulness with a spike of adrenaline. He sat up. The front half of his cabin was on fire. Flames were eating through the dry wood with terrifying speed, fed by the hot wind blowing through the open windows. Smoke was already filling the small space, thick and choking. Thomas could see orange light dancing across the walls, could feel heat building rapidly. Outside, he heard voices, men's voices, laughing. Should burn quick, dry as it is. Think the old bastard's inside? Hope so. Save us some trouble. They had set this fire deliberately. They were waiting to see if he would burn alive. Thomas's military instinct from his years watching soldiers during the war kicked in. He couldn't go out the front. That's where the fire was, where the men were. He dropped to the floor where the air was clearer, the smoke rising above him. He crawled toward the back of the cabin, toward the small window he used for ventilation. The heat was intense. He could feel it scorching his back through his nightshirt. Behind him, he heard the sound of wood collapsing, his few possessions being consumed by flame. He reached the window and pushed it open. It was small. He'd built it that way to keep out winter cold, and Thomas was not a small man, but fear and desperation gave him strength. He dragged himself through the opening, wood scraping his arms and chest, splinters digging into his skin. He tumbled out onto the ground behind his cabin, gasping in clean air. He could still hear the men at the front of the house, still laughing, confident. They didn't know he'd escaped. Thomas got to his feet, pain shooting through his knees and hips, 68-year-old joints protesting sudden movement. He ran anyway. Ran through the darkness toward Daniel's house, expecting at any moment to hear shouting behind him, to hear gunshots, to feel a bullet tear through his body. He made it. He pounded on Daniel's door with fists that were burned and bleeding. Daniel opened the door, took one look at his father's condition, and pulled him inside. "They tried to kill me," Thomas gasped. "My cabin. They burned it. Men waiting outside." Rachel was already moving, gathering water and clean cloths to treat the burns on Thomas's arms and back. Daniel grabbed his hunting rifle and looked out the window toward where Thomas's cabin would be. The orange glow of fire was visible, lighting up the night sky. "We need to wake everyone," Daniel said. "If they came for Papa, they might come for others." They rang the church bell, the emergency signal they'd established. Within minutes, people were emerging from cabins, carrying whatever weapons they had, gathering together. The men armed themselves with axes, hammers, hunting rifles, even farming tools. The women brought children to the church, the safest building in the settlement with its stone foundation. The attackers didn't come back that night. Perhaps they believed Thomas had burned. Perhaps they were surprised by the community's rapid response. Or perhaps they'd accomplished what they wanted, sending a message of terror. Thomas's cabin burned to the ground. The flames were visible for miles, bright enough to be seen from Ashland proper. The church bell had rung out, the sound carrying across the night. But no one came to help put out the fire. Not the volunteer fire brigade from town, not the sheriff, not anyone. The message was clear. Freeman's Quarter was on its own, and if its people died, no one with power would care. By dawn, Thomas's home was nothing but smoking ruins. Thomas stood looking at it, Daniel beside him, Rachel tending to his burns. The entire community had gathered, forming a protective circle around him. "I should stop," Thomas said quietly, his voice hoarse from smoke. "If I stop investigating, stop asking questions. Maybe they'll leave the rest of you alone. Maybe this will end. And if you stop," Marcus Webb said, "what happens the next time someone disappears? What happens when they take another one of our people, and no one's documenting it, no one's bearing witness?" "Marcus is right," Reverend Foster added. What you're doing matters, Thomas. It matters that someone is refusing to be silent. It matters that someone is keeping record. It matters, Sarah Tucker said, her voice breaking, that someone cares enough to remember my Mary, to write down her name, to say that she existed, and that what happened to her was wrong. Thomas looked around at the faces of his community, people who were terrified but determined, people who had survived slavery and war, and who would survive this too. He thought about the 5 names in his ledger, and the unknown number of others who had disappeared from other communities, their fates unrecorded and unremembered. Then I keep writing, he said. They helped him salvage what could be saved from his cabin, which wasn't much. The structure was completely destroyed, but the ledger was safe, still hidden under the floorboards in a compartment that had survived the fire. Thomas dug it up when the ashes had cooled, the oilcloth singed and blackened but intact, the book inside undamaged. He moved in with Daniel and Rachel. The community helped build a new sleeping area for him. A corner of Daniel's cabin partitioned off with blankets hung from the ceiling. It was cramped and offered no privacy, but Thomas didn't mind. He was alive. The ledger had survived. The work could continue. That night, sitting at Daniel's table by candlelight, Thomas opened the ledger and made a new entry. April 8, 1869. Attempted murder of Thomas Hayes. Cabin burned by unknown assailants while I slept. Voices heard outside, men waiting to see if I would burn alive. Escaped through rear window. Community responded to emergency bell. No assistance from town authorities. Cabin completely destroyed. This attack confirms suspicion that documenting disappearances is perceived as threat by those responsible. He wrote 2 more sentences. I will not be silenced by terror. I will continue to bear witness. Then he closed the ledger and wrapped it again in oilcloth, taking it to a new hiding place that only he and Daniel knew about. The war had just escalated, but Thomas Hayes was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to forget. The burning of Thomas's cabin had an effect the attackers probably didn't anticipate. Instead of cowing Freeman's Quarter into silence, it energized the community's resistance. The blatant murder attempt, and the complete lack of any official response, proved everything Thomas had been saying about the authorities' indifference and likely complicity. People who had been skeptical of Thomas's theories now became believers. People who had been too frightened to help now stepped forward. And people in other black communities throughout Ashland County heard what had happened and began reaching out. In May of 1869, a man named William Grant arrived in Freeman's Quarter asking for Thomas Hayes. William was from a settlement about 12 miles south, a community of freed slaves who called their area New Hope. 3 people had disappeared from New Hope over the past year, William explained, and after hearing about Thomas's work, the New Hope community wanted to coordinate efforts. Thomas met with William and several other representatives from New Hope, comparing notes and sharing information. The pattern was identical. People vanishing in the evening hours, last seen in or near white areas, no official investigation, complete indifference from authorities. We need to organize, Thomas said. Not just our 2 communities, but every black settlement in the county. We need to share information about disappearances, about suspicious activity, about threats. They created a network. Representatives from Freeman's Quarter, New Hope, and 3 other black settlements met once a month in a rotating location, always secret, always careful. They shared information about missing people, about men who offered suspiciously generous work opportunities, about any unusual activity near their communities. Thomas trained others in documentation. He showed them how to keep records, how to interview witnesses, how to map locations and create timelines. Soon there were 5 ledgers in existence, 1 in each community, all using the same format, all recording the growing list of disappeared people. The numbers were staggering. Between 1865 and 1869, they documented 31 missing people across Ashland County. 31 confirmed disappearances where family members could testify the person hadn't left voluntarily, where possessions and money had been left behind, where the circumstances were suspicious. And Thomas suspected there were more, people with no close family to report them missing, transients passing through who had no community ties, individuals whose disappearance went unnoticed by anyone who could document it. Louise, the cook who worked for the Henderson family, continued to pass information to Thomas through her cousin Delia. In June, she reported another overheard conversation that chilled Thomas's blood. They were talking about quotas, Louise said, her voice shaking. Mr. Henderson was complaining that demand was high, but supply was getting difficult. He said your people, meaning us, were getting too cautious, too organized. Tucker Harlan suggested they expand operations to other counties. Mr. Yates said they needed to be careful because federal authorities were still around, but Sheriff Parrish laughed and said federal authorities weren't interested in investigating the disappearance of colored people. Thomas documented this carefully. The terminology alone, demand, supply, operations, confirmed they were running a business that trafficked in human beings. He also learned more about Tucker Harlan's operation. Harlan's logging business provided perfect cover for transporting people. The Ocmulgee River ran through Ashland County down to the coast at Darien. Lumber was regularly floated downriver on barges and loaded onto ships. But hidden among legitimate cargo could be other shipments. Human cargo, drugged or restrained, packed in crates marked as mining equipment or machinery. From Darien, those ships could go anywhere. To remote plantation operations in coastal Georgia, to turpentine camps in the Pine Barrens, where workers labored under brutal conditions with no oversight, to phosphate mines in Florida where labor was cheap, dangerous, and largely invisible to the rest of the world. Places where a person could be worked to death, and no one would ask questions. It was a supply chain, Thomas realized with horror, just like during slavery. Dealers capturing and selling human beings to buyers who needed cheap labor. The only difference was that now it had to be done secretly. The legal framework stripped away, but the underlying economic incentive unchanged. Through the network, Thomas heard about similar patterns in neighboring counties. A community in Burke County had lost 6 people over 2 years. Another in Jefferson County reported 9 disappearances. The problem was regional, probably statewide, possibly throughout the South, and no one with authority was investigating. The network did more than just document, though. They also developed better protection strategies. Communities coordinated on timing. If one settlement was sending people into town for market day, representatives from other communities would go too, providing greater numbers and making it harder to isolate individuals. They established safe houses, friendly families in town, usually black but occasionally sympathetic whites, where people could stop if they felt threatened. They also began quietly spreading word about which white employers were safe and which weren't. Tucker Harlan's name topped the list of people to avoid working for under any circumstances. Several other names were added based on reports of suspicious behavior or connections to the men Louise had identified. It wasn't enough. People still needed to work, still needed to earn money, still had to interact with white employers and travel to town. The risk couldn't be eliminated, only managed. In August of 1869, a young man named Robert Shaw disappeared from New Hope. He'd been working for a white farmer, clearing stumps from a field. Robert's brother Henry reported that Robert had been offered extra money to stay late and finish the job after dark. Henry had warned Robert not to do it, had practically begged him to come home at regular quitting time. But Robert had needed the money. His wife was pregnant and he wanted to save up before the baby came. Robert never came home. His wife gave birth 3 weeks later to a daughter she named Robert's Grace, and Thomas wrote both the birth and the disappearance in his ledger, the joy and the tragedy on the same page, ink blurring where his tears fell. The network continued to grow throughout the rest of 1869 and into 1870. By the spring of 1870, they had representatives from 8 black communities, covering most of Ashland County and parts of 2 neighboring counties. They had documented 42 disappearances total, with more being added as people heard about the network and came forward with information about missing family members from previous years. Thomas was now 70 years old. His hands shook when he wrote, arthritis making every letter difficult. His eyesight was failing. He had to hold the ledger close to his face and write in bright sunlight or by multiple candles. His back, injured in the fire, ached constantly. But he kept writing, kept organizing, kept bearing witness, because someone had to, because the disappeared deserved to be remembered. Because justice, even if it never came, at least deserved to be demanded. In the summer of 1873, Thomas Hayes received news that felt like an answer to years of prayers. A federal marshal had arrived in Ashland County, investigating labor practices in the region. Marshal Henry Porter was in his mid-40s, a thin man with tired eyes who'd been appointed during the Grant administration. He was part of a federal effort to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments and investigate violations of freed slaves' rights in the South. His jurisdiction covered several counties in Georgia, and he'd been following up on reports of forced labor, debt peonage, and other schemes designed to maintain slavery under different names. Thomas learned about Porter's arrival from Margaret Lawson, the schoolteacher, who'd seen the marshal in town asking questions about labor conditions. Thomas's heart leapt. Finally, someone with actual authority who might investigate. Someone who could compel testimony, demand documents, arrest suspects. He immediately made contact, sending word through Margaret that he had important information to share. Porter agreed to meet him at the church in Freeman's Quarter, away from the white parts of town where such a meeting might draw unwanted attention. They met on a Tuesday evening in July. Thomas brought his ledger and all the documentation he'd compiled over 6 years. Maps, timelines, witness statements, everything. He also brought representatives from the network, people who could corroborate information and testify to the pattern of disappearances. Marshal Porter arrived with one assistant, a younger man who took notes. Porter himself was courteous, treating the black men and women he met with respect that was rare from white officials. He listened carefully as Thomas presented his evidence. Thomas had prepared for this meeting, organizing his presentation to be as clear and compelling as possible. He started with the numbers. 46 documented disappearances between 1865 and 1873, all from black communities in the region, all under suspicious circumstances. He showed Porter the pattern, people vanishing in evening hours, last seen near white areas, all leaving behind possessions and money, none giving any indication of planning to leave. He presented the timeline, showing clusters of disappearances that suggested periodic harvests of victims. He shared the witness statements, Louise's account of overheard conversations, Jackson Price's report of suspicious job offers, Robert Gill's observations of crates being loaded at night. He identified the suspects, Tucker Harland, Mr. Henderson, Mr. Yates, Mr. Phillips, and, critically, Sheriff William Parrish. He explained his theory about how the operation worked: capture, transport, sale to remote labor operations where no one would investigate conditions. Porter listened to everything. He studied the ledger, running his finger down the list of names. He examined the maps. He read the witness statements. His expression grew increasingly troubled. When Thomas finished, Porter was quiet for a long moment. Then he rubbed his face with both hands, and Thomas saw something in that gesture that made his stomach sink. It was the weariness of a man who knew what truth looked like, but also knew how little truth mattered when confronting entrenched power. "Mr. Hayes," Porter said finally, This is the most thorough documentation of civil rights violations I've seen in my 3 years in this position. You've done remarkable work here, work that should be the basis for multiple arrests and prosecutions. Hope flared in Thomas's chest. So you'll investigate, you'll pursue this? I will try, Porter said carefully. But I need you to understand what we're up against. Everything you've shown me is compelling circumstantial evidence. It builds a strong case for what you believe is happening. But I have no physical proof. No witnesses who saw an actual kidnapping take place. No recovered victims who can testify about what happened to them. No documents from the suspects, no confessions, no direct evidence. We have witness statements, Marcus Webb protested. We have people who overheard conversations. Second-hand accounts, Porter interrupted gently. Hearsay. Important for establishing probable cause, but difficult to build prosecutions on. And the people you're accusing are wealthy, powerful men with connections throughout the state. Mr. Henderson serves on the county board. Mr. Yates has relatives in the state legislature. Tucker Harland has business dealings with half the prominent families in Georgia. And Sheriff Parrish? Thomas asked, his voice hard. That's the biggest problem, Porter admitted. Local law enforcement is meant to be my partner in these investigations. If the sheriff himself is complicit, as you believe, then I'm working against the very system I'm supposed to work through. Any investigation I open, Parrish will know about it immediately. Any witnesses I interview, he'll learn their names. Any evidence I gather, he'll have opportunity to interfere with. So they're untouchable, Daniel said bitterly. Is that what you're telling us? I'm telling you that the system is designed to protect men like them, but that doesn't mean I won't try. Porter looked at Thomas with something like admiration. You've been fighting this battle for years, Mr. Hayes, without any resources, without any authority, with your life at risk. I can't do less than try, knowing what you've accomplished. Porter explained what he would do. He would file a report with his superiors, documenting the pattern of disappearances and Thomas's evidence. He would request permission to open a formal investigation. He would seek authority to subpoena records from Tucker Harland's business and others implicated. He would try to find physical evidence, shipping records, financial transactions, anything that might prove the trafficking operation. But he was honest about the challenges. Even if I find evidence and bring charges, the case would go before a local judge, to a local jury here in Ashland County. What do you think the chances are of getting a conviction when the defendants are wealthy white men and the victims are— He stopped himself. Colored, Thomas finished. You can say it. We know what we are in the eyes of the law. Porter's expression was pained. I wish I could tell you that the law treats everyone equally, but you know better than I do that it doesn't. What I can promise is that I'll fight for you. I'll do everything in my power to bring these men to justice. Before leaving, Porter asked about the attempt on Thomas's life, noting the burn still visible on Thomas's arms. Thomas recounted the night his cabin was burned, the men waiting outside, the complete lack of any official response. Did you report this to anyone? Porter asked. To who? Thomas replied. The sheriff who's probably involved. The federal authorities who weren't here. Porter wrote it all down. This is attempted murder. That's a federal crime. I can pursue this even without local cooperation. But they both knew how unlikely it was that anyone would be prosecuted for burning down a freedman's cabin, especially when no local witnesses would testify against white attackers. Marshal Porter left Ashland County 3 days later, promising to return once he'd received direction from his superiors. Thomas watched him go, wanting to hope but knowing better. He'd lived too long, seen too much, to believe that promises from authorities would necessarily lead to action. 6 weeks passed. Thomas heard nothing. The network continued its work, documenting 2 more disappearances during that time. A woman from a community in Burke County and a teenager from a settlement near Augusta. Finally, in September, Thomas received word from Porter via a letter delivered through Margaret Lawson. The marshal had filed his report. His superiors had reviewed it. They agreed the circumstances were troubling and warranted investigation. But there was always a but. Resources were limited. Federal reconstruction efforts were winding down as political will in Washington collapsed. Marshal Porter had been reassigned to focus on more clear-cut cases where direct evidence already existed. He was being pulled from routine investigations like Thomas's to deal with high-profile incidents that had garnered newspaper attention. The letter was apologetic. Porter had included Thomas's entire ledger in his report. It was now part of the official federal record, preserved in an archive somewhere in Washington. The disappearances had been documented and acknowledged, at least on paper, but no formal investigation would take place. No charges would be filed. No arrests would be made. "I'm sorry I couldn't deliver justice," Porter's letter concluded, "but please know that your work matters. You have created a record that will survive even if nothing is done with it now. Future generations will know what happened here. That may not seem like enough, but it's more than most victims of injustice ever receive." Thomas read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his ledger. He understood what Porter was really saying. The federal government was abandoning freed slaves to their fate. The protection that had been minimal to begin with was evaporating entirely. By 1874, federal troops had withdrawn from most of Georgia. The Marshal Service had been reduced to a skeleton staff. Enforcement of civil rights laws became virtually non-existent. The men Thomas had identified as trafficking in human beings continued their business without interference. And the disappearances continued. Freeman's Quarter and the network had their protective protocols, and those protocols were effective for their own communities. But people in other areas, people without organization or documentation, continued to vanish. Thomas heard about them through the network, tried to document them, added them to his ledger even though he never met them, even though all he had was second-hand reports. By the end of 1875, Thomas's ledger contained 63 names. 63 people who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in the 9 years since the Confederacy's defeat. 63 people who had tasted freedom, only to have it stolen back. Thomas was 75 years old now, his body failing him in ways that couldn't be ignored. His hands shook so badly that writing was agony. His eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he could barely see the page, even in bright sunlight. His heart, the doctor in Ashland proper had told him, when Thomas had scraped together enough money to see him, was weak and irregular. He had maybe a year, maybe less. He needed to prepare for what came after him. Thomas Hayes spent his final months ensuring the work would continue. He trained Daniel intensively in the documentation system, teaching him how to interview witnesses, how to verify information, how to organize records. Daniel, now 41 years old, accepted the responsibility with the same quiet determination his father had always shown. Thomas also made copies of the most important parts of his ledger, painstakingly writing out duplicate pages despite the pain in his hands. He distributed copies to trusted members of the network, ensuring that if one ledger was destroyed, others would survive. He wrote detailed instructions for continuing the documentation, including a list of people throughout Ashland County who could be trusted to provide information and people who should be avoided. He created a guide for training new record keepers, explaining the methods he'd developed over nearly a decade of work. In November of 1875, Thomas organized what would be his final meeting of the network. Representatives from 11 communities attended, gathering in the church at Freeman's Quarter. Thomas stood at the front, smaller and frailer than he'd been, his voice weak, but his words clear. "I won't be here much longer," he said, and when people started to protest, he raised a hand. "It's all right. I've lived 75 years, which is more than I ever expected during slavery. I've been free for 10 of those years. I've seen my granddaughter grow up knowing freedom from birth. That's enough. He paused, gathering his strength. But this work, documenting what's being done to our people, this can't end with me. It's too important. The men who are stealing us, selling us, returning us to slavery under different names, they're counting on us being too frightened or too weak to resist. They're counting on no one caring, no one remembering, no one bearing witness. We will remember, Marcus Webb said firmly. Every community here will continue documenting. We'll keep the network active. Do more than document, Thomas urged. Protect each other. Share information. Don't let anyone be isolated or vulnerable. And someday, when someone with power finally decides to care, make sure they have evidence. Make sure they have names and dates and circumstances. Make sure they can't pretend this didn't happen. He looked around at the faces watching him, people of all ages, survivors of slavery and children born into freedom, united by determination to resist oppression in whatever form it took. We may never see justice, Thomas said. The men responsible may never face consequences. But we can deny them the final victory. We can refuse to be forgotten. We can insist that our lives matter, that our missing people matter, that the crimes against us are real and terrible and wrong. That's what bearing witness means. That's what this work is for. The meeting concluded with prayer and quiet fellowship. Thomas felt a profound exhaustion, but also something like peace. He had done what he could. The rest would be up to others. Thomas Hayes died in his sleep on January 19, 1876, in the corner of Daniel's cabin, where he'd lived since his own home had been burned. His granddaughter Ruth, now 8 years old, was the first to notice that her grandfather wasn't breathing, that the gentle snores that usually punctuated his sleep were absent. Daniel stood over his father's body and wept. For the man who had survived so much, for the work that had consumed the final decade of his life, for the justice that had never arrived. Then he dried his tears and opened his father's ledger, making an entry in his own careful script. January 19, 1876, death of Thomas Hayes, age approximately 75 years, cause natural decline of health. Buried in the Freeman's Quarter Church Cemetery beside family. He died as he lived, bearing witness to injustice and refusing to be silenced. His work continues. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, representatives from every black community in the county and several from neighboring areas. They sang hymns and told stories about Thomas, not just about his documentation work, but about the man he'd been, the quiet strength he'd possessed, the way he'd never stopped believing that truth mattered. Daniel Hayes inherited the primary ledger. He continued the documentation for another 8 years, adding entries as the network reported new disappearances. The pattern persisted, though the frequency decreased, perhaps because the traffickers became more careful, perhaps because the network's protective strategies were effective, perhaps because the most vulnerable had already been taken. Daniel's entries were brief and factual, lacking his father's narrative detail, but maintaining the essential record. March 2, 1876. Marcus Webb, age 51, disappeared from Burke County, last seen leaving work at a turpentine camp, possessions found untouched, no official investigation. August 15, 1876, Hannah Price, age 22, disappeared from Ashland County, last seen accepting ride from white employer, never arrived home, no official investigation. February 10, 1877, Simon Foster, age 34, disappeared from Jefferson County. Circumstances suspicious. No official investigation. On and on the entries went, a litany of lost people, a catalogue of crimes no one with power cared to stop. In 1883, Daniel added a different kind of entry. November 12, 1883, Tucker Harlan died today, age 68, in his sleep. Wealthy and respected to the end. Never faced charges for trafficking in human beings. His business empire passes to his sons. The system that enabled him continues. Daniel's final entry came on June 3, 1884. The disappearances continue, though less frequently than before. Our protective measures help, but cannot eliminate the danger. We remain without effective legal protection. We remain without justice, but we remain. We survive. We remember. This ledger stands as witness to crimes committed against our people. May God judge what earthly authorities would not. He sealed the ledger and stored it with other family papers, where it would remain for decades, passed down through generations of the Hayes family, preserved but largely unexamined. In the years following Thomas Hayes's death and Daniel's final entry, Freeman's Quarter gradually declined. The optimism of the immediate post-war years had long since faded, replaced by the grim reality of Jim Crow. The rights that had been promised were stripped away through legal maneuvering and violent intimidation. The federal government that had briefly offered protection abandoned freed slaves to the mercy of the same power structures that had enslaved them. Some families from Freeman's Quarter moved away during the Great Migration, heading north toward Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, seeking opportunities and safety that Georgia could not provide. Others stayed but were trapped in a cycle of sharecropping and debt peonage that functioned as slavery under different terminology. The church that had been the center of community life fell into disrepair as the congregation dwindled. The school that Margaret Lawson had started closed when she died in 1889, and no one could be found to replace her. The network of black communities that Thomas had organized dissolved as people scattered or died. The protective protocols forgotten as new generations grew up without understanding why they'd been necessary. Sheriff William Parrish served in his position until his death in 1891. He was eulogized in the local newspaper as a pillar of the community and a steadfast defender of law and order during difficult times. His role in the disappearances was never mentioned, never investigated, never acknowledged. Tucker Harlan's business empire continued to prosper. His sons expanded the operations, purchasing more land, running more logging crews, shipping more freight down the Ocmulgee River. The crates marked mining equipment continued to be loaded at night, continued to be sent to distant destinations. If anyone suspected what else might be in those shipments, they kept their suspicions private. The official history of Ashland County during Reconstruction was written by white historians who described it as a period of difficult adjustment and outside interference. There was no mention of missing people, no mention of continued trafficking in human beings, no mention of Thomas Hayes or his years of documentation. When census records were updated, the disappeared people were simply not counted. Their absence was explained away as migration, death from natural causes, or clerical error. Census takers didn't dig deep into the circumstances of missing people from black communities. Why would they? Those lives had never been considered particularly important to document accurately. By 1900, Freeman's Quarter's population had dwindled to fewer than 20 people, mostly elderly individuals who had nowhere else to go. The cabins were falling apart, the gardens overgrown, the roads barely passable. By 1920, it was abandoned entirely. The small church and scattered homes left to decay back into the red clay soil that had grudgingly supported them for a generation. The physical community vanished, but the ledger survived. It passed from Daniel Hayes to his daughter Ruth, who kept it without fully understanding its significance. Ruth passed it to her son, Thomas Hayes Morrison, named after his great-grandfather, who stored it in an attic along with other family memorabilia. The truth became what it had always been. Something known by those without power, ignored by those with it, and slowly erased by the passage of time and the convenience of forgetting. For 87 years, from 1876 to 1963, Thomas Hayes's ledger sat in various attics and storage boxes, seen occasionally by family members who would page through it, note the careful handwriting, perhaps feel sadness at the names of disappeared people, but never quite know what to do with it. The story was too terrible, the injustice too complete, the lack of resolution too frustrating. It was easier not to think about it, easier to let it remain a family artifact of unclear significance, easier to move forward rather than dwell on horrors that couldn't be changed. But preservation is its own form of resistance. The family kept the ledger, kept it safe, kept it intact, even when they didn't fully understand why it mattered. Some instinct, some family loyalty to the great-grandfather or grandfather who had written those entries, made them keep the book rather than throw it away. And so it survived, waiting for someone who would understand its significance. Patricia Cobb was 26 years old in 1963, a graduate student at Emory University in Atlanta, working on her dissertation about African American communities in post-Civil War Georgia. She was the granddaughter of sharecroppers, the first person in her family to attend college, driven by a passion to recover the stories that official histories had erased or ignored. She'd spent 2 years traveling throughout Georgia, conducting interviews with elderly black residents, collecting oral histories before that generation passed away. She was documenting the lived experience of freedom, what it had meant, what it had cost, what dreams it had enabled or crushed. In September of 1963, she arrived in a small town called Millbrook, about 40 miles from where Ashland County used to be before county lines were redrawn in the 1920s. She'd been given the name of a woman named Anna Hayes Morrison, 91 years old, who had family connections to the area and might have stories to share. Anna lived with her daughter in a small house with a well-tended garden. She was sharp-minded despite her age, her memories of the past clearer than her memories of the present. She told Patricia about her grandfather, Daniel Hayes, who had farmed land that no longer existed under a community name no one remembered. "My father kept some of grandfather's old papers," Anna said. "Books and things. I have them in a trunk upstairs. Never knew quite what to do with them, but couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Patricia's heart quickened. Primary sources from the Reconstruction era were rare, especially from black communities. "Could I look at them?" Anna's daughter helped bring down an old trunk, the leather cracked and dry with age. Inside were papers, photographs, a few books, and there, wrapped in stained oilcloth that had protected it for decades, was Thomas Hayes's ledger. Patricia opened it with careful hands. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. She began to read, and as she read, the modern world fell away. The first entries were mundane: births, deaths, marriages, land transactions. But then came October 27th, 1867, and the entry about Benjamin Porter's disappearance. Then Esther Vaughan, then James Holloway, then more and more, Thomas's careful documentation of people vanishing, of his attempts to investigate, of the authorities' complete indifference. Patricia read about the community's protective measures, about the network formed to document disappearances county-wide, about Thomas's theory that trafficking in freed slaves was continuing under secret circumstances, about the attempt on his life, about Marshal Porter's failed investigation, about Daniel's continuation of the work. She read for hours, barely breathing, aware that she was holding something extraordinary. This wasn't just a historical document. It was a window into systematic crimes that had never been officially acknowledged, let alone investigated or prosecuted. "May I borrow this?" Patricia asked Anna. "I promise I'll take excellent care of it. But this is important. This is history that needs to be told." Anna looked at the ledger, at the words her great-grandfather had written by candlelight in a cabin that no longer existed, in a community that had been erased from maps and memory. "You'll tell his story? You'll make sure people know what happened?" "I will," Patricia promised. "I'll make sure people know." She spent the next 3 months tracking down every piece of information she could find about Ashland County during Reconstruction. She combed through property records, census data, court documents, newspaper archives. She found gaps everywhere, people who appeared in the 1860 enumeration of enslaved people but never appeared in subsequent records. Property deeds for Freeman's Quarter, showing land that had been settled and farmed, but was now listed as having always been vacant. Business records for Tucker Harlan's logging operation, showing shipments to suspicious destinations with vague cargo descriptions. She found no record of Benjamin Porter, Esther Vaughn, James Holloway, Mary Tucker, Joseph King, or any of the other 63 people named in Thomas's ledger. They had disappeared from official records as completely as they disappeared from life. She found no record of any missing persons investigation, no police reports, no sheriff's inquiries, no newspaper articles about mysterious disappearances. Nothing. The only evidence that any of it had happened was Thomas Hayes's ledger and the oral histories of descendants who had heard family stories about people who vanished. Patricia Cobb finished her dissertation in 1965. She included a chapter on Thomas Hayes and the disappearances in Ashland County, carefully documenting everything she'd found. Her work was thorough, compelling, and meticulously sourced. She laid out the evidence for systematic trafficking in freed slaves during Reconstruction, for the complicity of local authorities, for the federal government's abandonment of the people it had promised to protect. Her dissertation was approved with honors. Her professors praised her research, her analysis, her writing. The chapter on Thomas Hayes was called Groundbreaking and Essential Reading. When she tried to publish it, she hit a wall. One academic journal rejected it as too narrow in focus. Another said it was speculative despite the documentation. A third suggested she was reading too much into what might have been simple migration patterns poorly recorded in historical documents. A popular magazine said the story was too depressing and lacked resolution. Readers want to know that justice was served. One editor was more honest. This is an important story, but America in 1966 isn't ready to confront it. We're in the middle of a civil rights struggle. People want stories of progress, of wrongs being righted. Your story is about wrongs that were never righted, about injustice that was never addressed, about crimes that went unpunished. It's too uncomfortable. Maybe in another generation. Patricia kept trying. She taught history at a small college in Alabama, continuing to research similar cases throughout the South. She found patterns everywhere, disappearances of freed slaves, documented in private letters and diaries but never officially investigated. Oral histories in black communities about people taken and never seen again. Cryptic references in business records to labor acquisitions and specialty freight. She published 2 books on the subject in 1972 and 1979. They were well reviewed in academic circles but reached a limited audience. Most Americans never heard of Thomas Hayes or Freeman's Quarter or the systematic trafficking that had continued in the shadows of Reconstruction. The ledger itself, meanwhile, was donated to Emory University's Special Collections Library, where it was carefully preserved, catalogued, and made available to researchers. Over the decades, a handful of historians examined it, cited it in academic papers, included references to it in scholarly books that were read by other scholars but rarely by the general public. Thomas Hayes's work survived, but the justice he had sought never arrived. Part 13. What we know here is what we know for certain, verifiable through documentation. Thomas Hayes existed. Birth records are unclear. Enslaved people's births were rarely recorded accurately, but census records from 1870 list Thomas Hayes, age 65, living in Ashland County, Georgia, occupation farmer. He appears in land records as a witness to property transfers in an area that maps from the era show as predominantly black settlement. The ledger exists. You can see it today if you visit the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library at Emory University in Atlanta. It's stored in an archival box in a climate-controlled vault. The pages are yellowed and fragile, protected in mylar sleeves. The ink has faded to brown but remains legible. Request Box 47, Folder 12, Hayes Family Papers, 1865-1884. The entries are there, 63 names, 63 people who disappeared between 1865 and 1876 from Ashland County and surrounding areas. Each entry includes a name, approximate age, date of disappearance, circumstances, and notation that no official investigation took place. Census records corroborate gaps in the population. There are people listed as living in Ashland County in the 1860 enumeration of enslaved persons who never appear in any subsequent census, despite being young enough to have survived. Where did they go? No records indicate migration, death, or any other explanation. Sheriff William Parrish was a real person. He served as sheriff of Ashland County from 1866 to 1891. Newspaper archives contain articles praising his service. They also contain no articles about investigating disappearances of freed slaves, despite Thomas Hayes's documented attempts to report missing people. Tucker Harland owned a lumber and logging operation that shipped freight down the Ocmulgee River. Business records from the era show his operation was profitable and well-connected. They also show shipments of mining equipment and machinery to destinations that were primarily agricultural regions with no documented mining operations. Federal Marshal Henry Porter existed. He was appointed in 1871 and served until 1874, when federal enforcement of Reconstruction policies collapsed. His reports, preserved in National Archives records, document widespread violations of freed slaves' rights throughout Georgia. One report from 1873 references systematic disappearances of freed slaves in Ashland County, thoroughly documented by local community member, insufficient resources available for full investigation. These are facts. They are documented. They are verifiable. What we don't know for certain is exactly what happened to the 63 people who disappeared. Thomas Hayes believed they were captured and re-enslaved, sold to remote labor operations where they could be worked without oversight. The circumstantial evidence supports this conclusion. The pattern of disappearances, the involvement of men who had owned slaves and resented their loss, the suspicious business activities, the complete lack of official investigation, the attempt to murder Thomas when he got too close to the truth, all of this points towards systematic trafficking in human beings. But there were no trials, no confessions, no recovered victims who could testify, no physical evidence beyond the absences themselves and the suspicious circumstances surrounding them. The truth, in the strictest legal sense, remains unproven. What we do know is that between 1865 and 1877, thousands of formerly enslaved people disappeared throughout the South. Exact numbers are impossible to determine because records were poorly kept and investigations were non-existent. But historians who have studied the era estimate the number could be as high as tens of thousands. People who were captured and forced back into servitude through convict leasing, debt peonage, outright kidnapping, or other schemes designed to maintain the economic system slavery had provided. We know that various forms of forced labor continued throughout the South well into the 20th century. Convict leasing, where prisoners were rented out to private businesses and worked under brutal conditions, wasn't fully abolished in Alabama until 1928. Debt peonage, where workers were trapped by inflated debts they could never repay, persisted into the 1940s. The Supreme Court didn't outlaw involuntary servitude for debt until 1944. We know that crimes against Black Americans were routinely ignored by authorities. Lynchings went uninvestigated. Murders went unprosecuted. Theft of property and wages went unaddressed. The legal system that was supposed to protect all citizens functioned instead as a mechanism to control and exploit black people. We know that Thomas Hayes spent the last years of his life trying to get someone in authority to care about the disappearances, that he documented everything with painstaking care, that he organized his community to protect themselves when protection from authorities was unavailable, that he survived an assassination attempt and kept working, that he trained his son to continue the documentation after his death. We know that his work was ignored by everyone who had the power to investigate. The sheriff dismissed him. The federal marshal sympathized but ultimately did nothing. The newspapers never covered the story. The courts never heard cases. The criminals were never prosecuted. We know that Thomas Hayes died in 1876 without seeing justice, that the men he believed were responsible lived long, prosperous lives without facing any consequences, that the trafficking likely continued for years after his death, that the community he'd worked to protect slowly disintegrated under the weight of oppression and hopelessness. We know that his ledger survived because his family preserved it, passing it down through generations until someone recognized its significance. We know that Patricia Cobb fought for years to get Thomas Hayes' story into the historical record, facing resistance from publishers and editors who found the story too uncomfortable, too unresolved, too challenging to the narrative of inevitable progress. We know that even today, more than 150 years later, most Americans have never heard of Thomas Hayes or the disappeared people of Ashland County. The last page of Thomas Hayes' ledger contains a single sentence written in Daniel Hayes' hand, dated June 3, 1884. My father believed that one day someone would care enough to seek justice. I pray to God he was not wrong, though I fear he was. Wow, whether Thomas Hayes was right or wrong depends on what we choose to do with stories like his. Whether we examine them honestly or allow them to remain obscure. Whether we acknowledge the full horror of what happened or accept sanitized versions that make us more comfortable. Whether we recognize that the theft of freedom didn't end with the 13th Amendment, but continued in various forms for decades afterward. The people who disappeared from Ashland County never got justice. Their families never got answers. Thomas Hayes never got the investigation he fought for. The system that enabled their disappearances was never dismantled. The criminals were never punished. But their names are still there, written in fading ink on yellowing paper, preserved in a library archive, waiting for someone to see them, to acknowledge them, to remember that they existed, that they were stolen, that they mattered, and that the injustice of their disappearance and the system's refusal to address it represents a truth about America that we still struggle to face. Benjamin Porter, Esther Vaughan, James Holloway, Mary Tucker, Joseph King, Marcus Webb, Hannah Price, Simon Foster, Robert Shaw, and 54 others whose names Thomas Hayes carefully recorded because he understood that being forgotten is the final injustice, the ultimate erasure. They existed. They were free. They were taken. No one with power tried to help them. That is what we know. The rest is silence. The silence of official records that never acknowledged the crimes. The silence of newspapers that never reported the disappearances. The silence of courts that never heard the cases. The silence of a society that found it easier to look away than to confront the truth. Thomas Hayes refused that silence. He wrote down the names. He documented the crimes. He bore witness when no one else would. His ledger still exists. The names are still there. The question is whether anyone cares enough to remember them, to honor the work Thomas Hayes did, to acknowledge the injustice that was never addressed. Whether we choose silence or remembrance, that's up to us.